Welcome to QuickTime event, where because I spent the last 2 months in the wonderfully stress-inducing land of university and all of its grandeur, I couldn't get to reviewing particular pieces of media that I really wanted to get around to talking about. For these reviews, I will be using my patented rating system of random Roald Dahl vocabulary terms. Why? Because Roald Dahl rocks, deal with it. Today on the chopping block, we have Justice League, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, Beast Scarlet Witch, and Captain Falcon and Big Boss. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Zack Snyder's Justice League is probably the first time I've actually really enjoyed a film of his since maybe 300. I do think there is a bit of a barrier of entry to this kind of film because it is very deeply entrenched in Snyder's directorial style, and there are aspects of the film that some may view as a bit too self-indulgent, like the 4-hour runtime. But if you've been a fan of Snyder's other works, like his particular artistic style he brings to his films, or especially if you were in the crowd that actually really liked his previous DC Comics-based movies, there will definitely be more than a few things for you to latch onto during your viewing experience of this film. For one, the longer runtime, while in some ways working a little against the film's pacing, does ultimately service the plot in recontextualizing a lot of what was already present in the theatrical cut through the addition of scenes that result in a more emotionally resonant story, even if what it has to juggle during that runtime can sometimes result in the film buckling under its own weight, but only sometimes. A particular highlight of the movie and how it expands on what was already there before was, in my opinion, the characterization of Cyborg. Without spoiling anything, he was the character that stood out as the most well-rounded and satisfyingly developed in the movie, and the fact that much of his pivotal story beats between developing his relationship that he had with his dad, or even how he is tied to the history of the mother boxes, was basically mostly absent from the 2017 cut of the film, is honestly one of the most baffling exclusions among some of the other notable ones. The action sequences also feel a lot more visceral through Snyder's great direction, and the, at times, honestly pretty stunning cinematography by Fabian Wagner, a sequence that used to feel rather abrupt and awkwardly stitched together in the theatrical cut. The fight of the Themyscira between the Amazons and Steppenwolf is now turned into this rather tense chase sequence involving the Amazonian warriors passing the mother box around like a baton while on horseback, and it also does a rather good job of showcasing Steppenwolf's radical redesign. A redesign I thought was initially way too overdone and overcompensating, but actually ended up not bothering me as much as I thought it would. He also ended up being a lot more expressive than I would have anticipated given how small his head was compared to the bulk of his body, a problem that I had with Raphael in the Michael Bay Ninja Turtles films. There are but two flaws that I have with the film. The first being that I think a lot of the additional scenes, particularly the ones that are drawn out or involve extensive usage of Snyder's trademark slow-motion filming techniques, could have either been trimmed down as fat or removed entirely. Without spoiling anything, there's a scene later on in the film that serves as a soft introduction to Barry Allen and his Speed Force powers that wasn't in the original film, but it was very obviously an attempt to ape the style of the Quicksilver scenes in the recent X-Men films. And there's a particular gag involving food that I thought felt very arbitrary and forced in execution in conjunction with the choice of music accompanying the scene, and I felt that it could have been trimmed down substantially while still getting the point across. There are also 3 dialogue exchanges between Steppenwolf and another character related to Darkseid who takes on an advisory role to him where they discuss his progress in finding the mother boxes on Earth, and the second scene involving this conversation is extremely repetitious and derivative of the original scene of them talking, and I felt that it could have just been removed from the film entirely so that the film may have been streamlined a little bit more, since I think the first and third scenes involving this scenario were effective enough on their own in communicating what Steppenwolf's ultimate motive was, which in of itself is a bit more fleshed out here than it was in the theatrical cut. He still doesn't receive a drastic amount of further characterization compared to other characters in the film, but he's adequate enough and has just enough of a motivation to add some sort of substance to his actions. The additional scenes complaint that I had also to an extent applies to the ending. It's the kind of ending where I thought that it was going to end at one point and then it just kept going and going. I get that Snyder probably had added these with the knowledge that he might not ever get to revisit this franchise and wanted to give the most dense amount of content to his fans, but there is such a thing as too much, and I feel like the ending was specifically an example of that, with how many times you think it's going to finally conclude and wrap up, but then it keeps going. The other major flaw I have with this film is its handling of Lois Lane. She was hyped up as this super important key character in Snyder's plan for his films going forward, yet most of her screen time basically told me next to nothing about her perspective on these events, and it didn't really give her much to do in the plot for how important she supposedly is. There is a key scene that addresses her grief and inability to move on from Superman's death from Batman v Superman, but other than that, the large majority of her stake in the film involves rather repetitive and narratively stagnant sequences of her going to Superman's memorial monument and grieving, or other mundane tasks that just serve as super minute additions to the runtime when they could have done a lot more with the character than what I ultimately found was filler content, especially given she could have been a more ground-level character that offered a uniquely human perspective on what it was like to live in a world affected by the advent of superpowered individuals going public, given part of the film involves Bruce and Diana seeking out the other members of this would-be ensemble. These flaws, however, are ultimately few in number, and I'm happy to say that despite my lack of enthusiasm or excitement for this film coming off of Snyder's other DC movies, this one pleasantly surprised me, and it's definitely worth at least one watch. Zack Snyder's Justice League is, as Roald Dahl would say, next for Psych, it's a TV show! WandaVision is a show that I basically went in with no expectations, since I barely saw any of the trailers and was ultimately kept in the dark about the actual plot details outside of the sitcom element, and Vision being still somehow alive and well. And after watching the entire series as it was coming out from January to around March, I can say that after the slow start, WandaVision picked up and I was definitely engaged throughout. Admittedly, the first two episodes in particular felt like extremely slow burns, largely due to how dedicated the show was to preserving the faithfulness of older sitcoms like The Dick Van Dyke Show. I personally didn't really laugh at many of the jokes or wince at the scenarios they were put in. However, the intentional adherence to this style actually ended up servicing the escalation of tension as the show progressed, since anytime the supposed sitcom reality tended to crack and expose a little more of itself, it can come off as genuinely disturbing or at the very least unnerving at times. And once you found out the reason this whole show is structured in such an unorthodox manner, it turns from a deceivingly innocent satire of sitcom tropes throughout the decades to a more somber and honestly pretty tragic show considering the circumstances underneath the pretty production design and jovial tone. However, those looking for a show that feels like standard MCU fare coming to the small screen will be a bit disappointed. It actually takes a little bit for the big plot to come into focus, and how much it hooks you to an extent depends on how invested you were in the preceding episodes and the abstract aura that surrounded them. When the show is focusing on characters that aren't the titular namesake protagonists, it'll feel like it's treading into a lot more familiar territory, and I do like the new additions to the cast wholeheartedly. I think Darcy Lewis was way more likable here than she was in either Thor film she was in, and I think Jimmy Woo definitely has staying power as a supporting character, and I'd love to see him in something like an Agents of Atlas movie one day. And I really dug the direction they took with Monica Rambeau, which also further addressed the sheer ramifications caused to human society by the likes of both Thanos' initial snap in Infinity War and Hulk's blip 5 years later in Endgame, something that was also to a point touched on in Spider-Man Far From Home. Towards the end of the show, it becomes increasingly obvious the direction they're taking particular characters, especially in the case of Monica, but they were developed well enough that you want to see more and where they head in the future, since it's been confirmed that unlike the previous era of MCU set shows under Marvel Television, the Disney Plus series by Marvel Studios are actually going to not only segue or converge into future films, but also have lasting effects that are reflected in future MCU projects, such as newly introduced characters or specific events that take place. The real focal point of the show was developing Wanda Maximoff, and in that area they especially succeeded. She isn't a protagonist in the traditional sense, but it's a great culmination of all the development given to her since Age of Ultron, even finally touching on her specific sour spots in her journey as an Avenger, such as grieving over Quicksilver's death, and in that regard, seeing where she ends up in the end was all the more satisfying. If there's one particular complaint I have, it's that I really didn't care for the antagonist for the show. They had valid points for why they wanted to do what they wanted to do, but it felt like kind of an afterthought next to other characters' arcs. Now this may be to give more attention specifically to Wanda, given the story centered on her within the show, but it doesn't mean they couldn't have at least given him more of an emotional center or reason to understand their motives outside of the super surface level stuff. There is a second character in the show that does play sort of an antagonistic role, but they're significantly more behind the scenes and don't really have their intentions outed until the final few episodes. And they are the center of a great sequence that's very Disney, and extremely memorable to the point of being infectious, and I think you've already heard of it based on how viral it's gotten. Overall, however, I really liked WandaVision. It's not your standard MCU project, even if it inches closer to that towards the ending, but it's held up by great character work for the two leads, a likable supporting cast, and a solid emotional center. It takes a while to get off the ground, but when the emotional beats hit, they really stick the landing and excite you for where these arcs could go in the future now that the shows are more intrinsically tied to the films. WandaVision is definitely giganticus. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier is definitely the show people who wanted a more standardized MCU story in an episodic format would have been looking for. This show, just like WandaVision, takes place after Endgame and explores the arc of Sam Wilson taking on the Captain America mantle after being given the shield by an elderly Steve at the end of that film. Except it doesn't just stop there. Despite being together in a story that is structured in a similar vein to a buddy cop setup, both Sam and Bucky go through very different and emotionally distinct arcs. Sam has to wrestle with the realities and responsibilities of being Captain America in a modern age given his background, while Bucky, who is still burdened with the guilt over the crimes he committed under the influence of Hydra, is working to attempt to resolve that era of his history by confronting those he felt he wronged directly. On that note, a big strength of the show was the chemistry between Sam and Bucky as characters. Anthony Mackie and Sebastian Stan really played off each other extremely well and carried that sense of passive-aggressive dynamic that they had in Civil War, while also being extremely likable as individual leads. On the subject of performances, the big standout one to me in particular was Wyatt Russell as the character of John Walker. Anyone with the background knowledge of who the character is in the comics and what he becomes will know exactly where they're taking him by the end, but it's extremely satisfying, and for the character he has to play, he did a phenomenal job. There's a particular moment involving him that just sells him as this character. Without spoiling anything, he's set up as this person who's obviously had every good intention going into this particular role that he has to play, but he's clearly not in the right state of mind and has a moral code that is more along the lines of the ends justifying the means, while not considering stuff like public perception or even how much safer people would feel with him as their protector. In that regard, John Walker is one of the best written characters in the show, and perhaps even in the entire MCU in my opinion. The quality of his writing and his storytelling involving him honestly rivaled the Netflix Marvel shows at their best to me. Another big plus is the action sequences. We've returned to the sort of raw and grounded feel of the mainline Captain America films, where action is mostly reliant on hand-to-hand, close-quarters combat, and it adds a lot of tension with how everything is choreographed and staged. One of my particular favorite sequences was in episode 4, as it really emphasized the power discrepancy between those injected with the super soldier serum and those who are really just regular guys with no superpowers or physiological enhancements at all. The show even flat-out cold opens with an action sequence involving Falcon taking down terrorists near a regional border, and it's some of the most fist-clenching, tense stuff I've seen in terms of spectacle and viscerality this year. When the show pulls back for more quieter moments, it definitely hit a lot of powerful emotional beats that address not just the outcome of the events of both Infinity War and Endgame, but also the predicament that a character like Sam Wilson is given in his place in his society. It brings up a lot of interesting discussion about race, wealth, disparity, and how far some people will go to exact what they believe is justice in a world that they view as unjust. On that note, however, The one weak aspect of the show I thought was the characterization of the Flag Smashers, and in particular the main antagonist Carly Morgenthau, who is obviously based on the originally male singular Flag Smasher Carl Morgenthau. She's played by Erin Kellyman, and if you've seen her in Solo a Star Wars story where she played the leader of the Cloud Riders Enfys Nest, she's in a very similar role there. Ultimately, the show tries to raise questions about attaching labels to people like her to commit acts of extremism to course correct what they view as a corrupted system that doesn't do enough to accommodate for those who aren't as accepted by society, but to a point that it felt flat largely due to the fact that Carly and her line of logic by that point was already breaching several moral and ethical lines that she already gave off when she was a somewhat corrupted individual that wasn't really deserving of much in the way of actual sympathy. They tried to basically do to her what, for example, the Metal Gear games did for the character of Big Boss in playing up the whole one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter message, but by that point you've already been shown on more than a few occasions that even if she comes from a place of good intent, her actions and what she does to justify her line of reasoning is anything but. So the attempt to paint her in a humanized light didn't exactly work for me, although I could see where they were coming from with the messaging, especially by the end. Overall, however, this show was spearheaded by excellent performances, fantastic action sequences, a narrative with a very organic sense of escalation and build-up that addresses issues both relevant to the world it is set in as well as our own world, and once again a pretty great soundtrack by Henry Jackman, who returned to score the show like he did for the latter two Captain America films. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier is definitely glorious. This has been a QuickTime event. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and stay solid.